This is the most shocking, gut-wrenching, and unforgettable case you'll ever see. A quiet Pennsylvania neighborhood, a devoted mother, and a fire that hid something far more sinister than anyone could imagine. When 35-year-old Joy Hibbs was found dead in her burning home, the truth seemed buried forever, blocked by lies, corruption, and a secret that protected the killer for over 30 years. But when the truth finally came out, it exposed betrayal, cover-ups, and the ultimate fight for justice. This is the most heartbreaking and jaw-dropping story you will ever hear, and you need to see how it ends. Joy Hibbs was born on September 23, 1955, in the small town of Chief, Florida, the youngest of 9 children in a close-knit, loving family. Surrounded by siblings, she grew up with a deep appreciation for the outdoors. Hiking, fishing, and anything that kept her close to nature brought her joy. She was also athletic, a dedicated runner who once competed in marathons, and a passionate football fan who never missed a game. In high school, Joy met Charlie, the young man who would become her lifelong partner. Their connection was instant, and not long after graduation, they were married. The couple relocated to Pennsylvania, settling in the small town of Cudden. Joy had long dreamed of a career in the medical field. Without formal qualifications, she began in entry-level roles, working as a veterinary assistant before enrolling in local college courses to earn a degree. Her determination paid off. She became a physical therapist at a small clinic, just a short drive from home. By 1975, at the age of 20, Joy was a mother. She and Charlie welcomed a daughter, followed 3 years later by a son. They settled into a quiet suburban neighborhood where life appeared ideal, a perfect family living the American dream. That dream shattered on April 19, 1991. It was a Friday. Joy, now 35, was scheduled to work an evening shift. That morning, she helped her children get ready for school, kissed her husband goodbye as he left for work, and prepared for her day. She ran errands, stopping at the grocery store before heading to the bank to cash a check. At around 1 p.m., her 12-year-old son, David, came home from school. Spotting his mother's car in the driveway, he was eager to share the good grades he'd earned that day. But as he approached the house, his excitement gave way to confusion, and then dread. Thick smoke billowed from inside. At first, David thought maybe his mother had left something cooking on the stove. But when he opened the front door, he was met with the sight of flames ripping through the interior. Panic set in. David tried to push inside to find his mom, but the choking smoke and searing heat forced him back. Neighbors, seeing the smoke, called the fire department. Firefighters arrived quickly and fought the blaze, eventually containing it. In the final room they searched, they found a body. Paramedics and police on the scene assumed it was Joy, but the burns were so severe that visual identification was impossible. The remains were sent to the medical examiner for confirmation. Word of the fire spread quickly through the small town. At school, Joy's teenage daughter heard fragments of the news and rushed home, only to find her younger brother crying in the yard. Moments later, Charlie arrived. When police told him a body had been found inside the house, he collapsed on the spot, overcome with shock. At the time, firefighters were still assessing the scene, unsure what had sparked the blaze. But in the chaos, Joy's son couldn't stop blaming himself. He kept thinking about the messy tangle of cords in his bedroom, his computer, the fish tank, everything plugged into a single outlet. Since his mother's body had been discovered in that room, he convinced himself the fire had started there and that she died trying to put it out. But as crews worked to extinguish the flames, something didn't add up. Firefighters noticed burn patterns that suggested multiple points of origin, an almost impossible occurrence in an accidental fire. A closer inspection confirmed it. There were 4 separate places in the house where the blaze had been deliberately set. On the kitchen stove, all 4 gas burners had been left on, with bits of debris scattered across them. It appeared the arsonist had used the stove to help spread the fire throughout the house. The theory of arson was soon supported by the medical examiner's findings. The body was officially identified as Joy. But there was no smoke in her lungs. She had been dead before the fire started, and the cause of death was as brutal as it was clear. Joy's body bore multiple cuts, bruises, and stab wounds. This was no tragic accident. It was murder. With that confirmation, the investigation shifted to a homicide case. But the fire had destroyed most of the home, leaving few clues to work with. There was no foreign DNA on Joy's body, no obvious physical evidence to lead the way. With the trail already cold, detectives turned their attention to the next step, figuring out who could have wanted Joy Hibbs dead. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. The first person police turned their attention to was Joy's husband, Charlie. He'd been at work when the fire started, but investigators couldn't completely rule out the possibility that he'd left, committed the crime, and returned to establish an alibi. In homicide cases, spouses are often scrutinized first, and this one would be no different. Still, there were no signs of marital strife. Friends and family described the couple as happy, and those who knew Charlie said he seemed genuinely shattered by his wife's death. Despite that, detectives kept him on their list of potential suspects, at least for a time, before shifting focus to other leads. They began questioning Joy's friends and co-workers, probing for any hint of conflict or anyone who might have wanted to harm her. The responses were unanimous. Joy was kind, caring, and well-liked. She didn't make enemies. Investigators also considered whether she might have been a random target. Every Friday, Joy cashed a check at the bank, and the day of the fire was no different. She would have been carrying some cash. Yet when police searched the home, they found her wallet empty on the couch and her purse dumped out on the kitchen floor, as if someone had been searching for something specific. Robbery seemed plausible at first, but the theory quickly lost strength. Aside from a relatively small amount of cash, nothing else in the house was missing. Valuables had been left untouched, suggesting this was no simple burglary. That led detectives to a far more disturbing possibility. Joy's murder had been targeted, and soon, unsettling details began to surface about the months leading up to her death. Her family recalled a string of strange, troubling incidents. On one occasion, someone hurled a brick through the Hibbs window. Another time, the front door was damaged, and the tires on Joy's car were slashed while it sat parked outside the house. Back then, Joy and Charlie had brushed them off as random acts of vandalism. But in the wake of her murder, those incidents felt less like coincidences and more like warning signs. As detectives worked to piece the puzzle together, they turned their attention to Joy's neighbors, hoping someone had seen or heard something. No one recalled anything unusual during the earlier incidents of vandalism. But when asked about the day of the fire, several neighbors shared something that made investigators sit up. Just before the blaze, a blue Monte Carlo had been seen parked in front of Joy's house. No one caught a glimpse of the driver. No one saw the license plate. When police mentioned the car to Joy's family, they got their first real lead. Joy's son said his mother had a friend named April, someone who occasionally drove a car like that. Digging deeper, investigators learned April and her husband, Robert, had once lived just a few houses away. Recently, however, they'd lost their home due to financial problems and moved out of the neighborhood. According to friends and relatives, Joy and April had become close soon after April moved in. But there was more to the story. Neighbors described Robert as volatile, quick to anger, and prone to violence. Rumors swirled that he abused his wife. Because of this, April often sought refuge at Joy's house, bringing her kids along to escape the tension at home. Joy's son recalled at least one heated exchange between Robert and his mother. He'd overheard a phone call in which Robert not only shouted at her, but threatened her outright. When detectives ran Robert's name, a troubling picture emerged: a long criminal history, much of it drug-related. The more they learned, the more they considered him a viable suspect. Perhaps Robert resented Joy for supporting his wife, seeing her as a threat to his control. In that scenario, his anger could have easily escalated to violence. The police reached out to the narcotics division, whose officers knew Robert well from prior arrests. They agreed to help, even offering to speak with him directly. When confronted, Robert denied any involvement in Joy's death. He claimed he'd been out of town for the entire weekend, on a family vacation with April and the kids. But detectives noticed a glaring problem with his alibi. The murder happened on a Friday afternoon. Even if Robert had left town later that day, there was still plenty of time for him to stop by Joy's house first. One thing caught the officers' attention when they first spoke with Robert: a fresh scratch running along his arm. But when asked about it, he brushed it off and continued to insist he had nothing to do with Joy's murder. In the days that followed, Robert shut down completely. On the advice of his lawyer, he stopped speaking with investigators. When they asked him to take a polygraph, he refused. Every attempt to reach him after that went nowhere. With his cooperation gone, detectives turned to physical evidence that might connect him to the crime. They revisited the neighbors who had spotted the blue Monte Carlo outside Joy's house and took them to Robert's residence, hoping for a match. It wasn't the break they'd hoped for. Robert's Monte Carlo wasn't blue. It was black. And the neighbors were adamant it didn't look like the car they'd seen that day. Detectives also dug into Robert's alibi and found it solid. Records showed he and his family had checked into a hotel in another city on Friday, the same day as the murder. Even more, phone records confirmed that just before leaving home, he'd been on a call with one of his wife's friends, around the very time Joy was killed. With no evidence tying him to the scene, Robert began to slip from the top of the suspect list. The investigation shifted back toward Joy's husband, Charlie. This time, new whispers emerged. Several of Joy's co-workers told police she had been receiving threatening phone calls in the weeks before her death. One co-worker admitted she suspected the caller might have been Charlie but had never confronted Joy about it. Despite the suspicion, Charlie's alibi remained firm. Multiple co-workers confirmed he'd been at work all day on April 19th. Still, detectives couldn't entirely dismiss the idea that he might have slipped away, committed the crime, and returned unnoticed. They brought him in for questioning multiple times and had him take several polygraph tests. Nothing in his demeanor suggested guilt. He had no criminal record, no known history of violence, and no signs of aggression toward Joy during their marriage. Eventually, police decided Charlie's involvement was unlikely. With no suspects left and no fresh leads, the case ground to a halt. With no solid evidence and no clear suspects, the investigation into Joy's murder stalled. The case was quietly pushed aside, revisited only occasionally, and each time, detectives ran headfirst into a dead end. Years passed. decades even. Joy's children grew up under the shadow of their mother's unsolved murder, the unanswered questions haunting them. Her son, in particular, refused to let it go. He repeatedly contacted police, pleading for a renewed investigation. Each time he left disappointed. In one conversation, detectives told him bluntly that they still suspected his father, Charlie, but they simply didn't have the evidence to prove it. Then, in 2014, 23 years after Joy's death, the case was finally reopened. It was handed to the cold case unit, where a fresh team of detectives began combing through every piece of evidence from the beginning. Almost immediately, something unusual jumped out. A large portion of the communication with Robert, one of the original prime suspects, had been handled not by homicide detectives, but by the narcotics division. It was strange, and it was wrong. This was a murder investigation, yet an unrelated department had been deeply involved. The new team couldn't understand why, so they sought answers from one of the original investigators. At first, the retired detective refused to discuss the case, but after multiple attempts, he finally agreed to talk. What he revealed stunned them. From the start, Robert had been considered the most likely suspect, but there was a catch, one that tied the hands of the original investigative team. They'd been told, in no uncertain terms, to stay away from him. Pursuing Robert too aggressively was off the table. The reason? Robert wasn't just a neighborhood troublemaker. He was a confidential informant for the narcotics division. And not just any informant. He was central to a massive, years-long operation targeting a major drug trafficking network. To protect that operation, the department had decided not to risk alienating him. As a result, homicide investigators conducted only a superficial probe into his possible involvement in Joy's murder, then quietly moved on. The revelations about Robert's protected status marked a turning point in Joy's case. The new team of detectives decided to start from scratch, dismantling his decades-old alibi piece by piece. Back in 1991, police had determined that Robert was accounted for at the time of the murder. But the cold case investigators knew they couldn't simply trust outdated reports. They would verify everything themselves. Their first step was to track down Robert's wife's friend, the one he supposedly called around the time Joy was killed. She confirmed the call happened, but her memory carried a critical detail the original investigators had missed. It wasn't in the afternoon, as police once believed. It was much later, closer to evening. Next, they re-interviewed witnesses who had allegedly seen Robert with his wife and kids checking into a hotel that day. The original case file claimed the family arrived shortly after lunch, but the witnesses now said it was around 5 p.m., hours later than reported. That shift in the timeline changed everything. It meant Robert had more than enough time to commit the murder before joining his family. Finally, detectives sought out April herself. By now, she and Robert were divorced, but she still backed his alibi, insisting there was no way he could have been involved. Investigators pressed her repeatedly, hoping for cracks in her story. None came. With April holding firm, the team pushed forward, re-examining every piece of evidence, chasing down every lead. Years passed with no breakthrough. Then, in 2016, something completely unexpected happened. April walked into the police station and said she was ready to talk. A string of personal hardships, she explained, had forced her to reevaluate the past, and what she told them shattered the case wide open. April admitted she had lied about Robert's alibi from the very beginning. The truth, she said, was far darker. On the day of the murder, Robert came home covered in blood. When she demanded to know what had happened, he looked at her and said, "I stabbed someone and set a house on fire." After Robert's chilling admission, he ordered April to pack up the kids. They left for another city under the guise of a weekend getaway. Robert brought along a large bag, and during a walk in the park, he slipped away into the woods alone. When he returned minutes later, the bag was gone. It wasn't until a few days later, when detectives came knocking, that April began to understand the truth. She confronted Robert, begging him to come clean. Instead, he lashed out, beating her and threatening to frame her for the murder if she ever spoke up. For decades, fear kept her silent, but now she was ready to tell the truth. Her testimony transformed the investigation. Still, detectives knew a jury would want more, hard evidence or a confession. So they crafted a plan and asked April to help. They wired her with recording equipment and staged a visit from officers who questioned her about Joy's murder. Immediately after they left, April called Robert, sounding nervous. She told him the police had been asking questions and she didn't know how to respond. Robert's reaction was instant and revealing. He told her to refuse to speak with investigators and to avoid answering anything about the case. There was no outrage, no denial, only an urgent push to shut the conversation down. The recording became a critical piece of evidence. With it, detectives began building their case, a process that would take several years. Finally, in May 2022, Robert was arrested. He continued to deny any involvement, but the district attorney believed the evidence, combined with April's testimony, was strong enough to secure a conviction. April was set to be the key witness, and the case seemed poised for trial. But then came another twist. When Robert's son took the stand, he dropped a bombshell. He testified that after the staged phone call between Robert and April, his father had phoned him as well. During that conversation, Robert admitted the police were questioning April about the murder, and that there was a real chance he could spend the rest of his life in prison. Robert told his son he wanted to prepare him for what might come, and then began talking about Joy's murder. He never gave a direct confession, but his words were unsettling. "I think I did it," he said. The testimony added yet another layer to an already strong case, but prosecutors still needed to address one lingering question: motive. The evidence painted Robert as a man with a long history of conflict with Joy, a volatile temper, and a criminal record. On the day of the murder, it appeared he had stolen the cash Joy withdrew from the bank just hours earlier. Yet there was a darker possibility. After the case made headlines again, Robert's relatives from another state reached out to detectives. They hadn't spoken to him in years, but when they saw Joy's photograph on the news, they were stunned. Joy's face, they said, was eerily similar to someone from Robert's past, his own aunt. When Robert was a teenager, they revealed he had sexually assaulted and beaten that aunt. The resemblance between her and Joy was undeniable. Detectives began to consider whether Robert's attack on Joy had been sexually motivated. Proving it, after more than 3 decades, was impossible. Even without that certainty, the jury was convinced. Robert was found guilty of Joy Hibbs's murder and sentenced to life in prison. For Joy's family, the verdict was long-awaited justice, but it came with bitter truths. Robert had lived freely for over 30 years, shielded in part because police had chosen to protect a major narcotics investigation rather than pursue a prime suspect in a brutal homicide. In effect, Joy's life had been weighed against a drug case and lost. Still, the family expressed deep gratitude to the cold case detectives, whose persistence had finally brought the truth to light. For Joy's son, there was another measure of relief. The end of a decades-long doubt planted by the original investigation. He now knew his father had no part in the crime that had haunted his family since 1991. Be sure to let us know what you think of the story in the comments below. And if you like this video, smash the like button and don't forget to subscribe. A playlist is going to pop up right now with more videos you'll love. See you guys next time.